Have you ever met someone and felt like you understood them completely? The way they spoke, the way they smiled, the way they carried themselves, everything felt clear, predictable, safe. And then something changed. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just enough to make you pause. A reaction that didn't match the moment. A silence that felt heavier than it should. A shift in energy you couldn't quite explain. And in that moment, something doesn't feel right. You start replaying everything. What did I miss? There's always that one person, the one who seems calm until something small sets them off. At first, it feels out of place, unexpected, but to them, it isn't. It's familiar. And that's the moment you begin to realize something deeper. You are never seeing the real person. You are seeing the version they learn to show. This happens more often than people think. Not because people are fake, but because what you see is rarely what's actually there. Most people don't show who they are. They show what works, what gets approval, what avoids conflict, what keeps them accepted in a world that quietly judges everything. And over time, they get so good at it, they start believing it themselves. So when you try to understand someone, you're not just reading a person. You're reading layers, a version they present, a version they protect, and a version they don't fully understand. And this is where most people get it wrong. They think behavior is logical. It's not. People don't act based on what makes sense. They act based on what they feel. And those feelings didn't start today. They were shaped years ago. Through moments they never talk about, through experiences they never processed. Through patterns they've repeated so many times they no longer question them. That's why someone can say they trust you and still pull away. Why someone can look confident but react defensively to the smallest thing. Why someone can seem calm on the surface but carry something unsettled underneath. If you only listen to what people say, you will misunderstand them. If you only look at what people do, you will miss the reason behind it. And if you take everything at face value, you will always be one step behind. But there's another way to see people. A deeper way, one that goes beyond words, beyond surface behavior, beyond the version of themselves they show the world. It begins with understanding something simple but often ignored. Human behavior follows patterns. Patterns shaped by fear, by desire, by the need to belong. And the fear of losing control. And once you begin to see those patterns, something changes. You stop reacting so quickly. You stop taking things personally. You stop being confused by people's actions because now you're not just seeing what they do. You're seeing why they do it. And this is where everything shifts. The more you understand people, the less they can control how you feel. Not because you become distant, but because you become aware. You notice what others ignore. You hear what isn't being said. You see the gap between who people are and who they're trying to be. This is not about manipulating others. It's not about control. It's about clarity. Because when you truly understand people, you stop expecting them to act differently than they are. And that alone changes everything. In this audio book, you're not just going to learn how to read people. You're going to learn how to see the patterns behind behavior, the emotional triggers that drive reactions, the hidden forces shaping every decision. And most importantly, you're going to start seeing people in a way you never have before. Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. And from that point on, you're no longer reacting to people. You're understanding them. And that is where real power begins. Chapter 1. The Illusion. Why you never really see people clearly. There's a moment most people have experienced but rarely stop to think about. You meet someone. At first, everything feels simple. They're easy to talk to. They seem genuine, consistent. Nothing feels off. So naturally, you relax. You trust what you see. And then over time, something shifts. Not all at once, just small things. A reaction that feels slightly out of place. A tone that carries something you didn't notice before. A moment where they act differently, and suddenly you're left with a quiet question. Was this always there? There's a moment like this that most people remember. A conversation that felt normal until one sentence changed everything. The tone shifts, the energy tightens, and suddenly you're not talking to the same version of them anymore. Most people answer that moment the wrong way. They assume something changed, but more often than not, nothing changed. You just started seeing more. And this is the part most people never realize. You don't misunderstand people, you just believe them too early. The version of someone you meet in the beginning is rarely their full reality. It's a curated version, not fake, just controlled. Controlled to be accepted, controlled to be liked, controlled to avoid rejection. Because whether people realize it or not, they are constantly adjusting themselves based on how they think they will be perceived. Think about how people enter a new environment. They don't reveal everything. They observe first. They notice what's acceptable, what gets approval, what gets ignored, and then they adapt. They soften certain traits. They hide certain thoughts. They amplify what works. And over time, that version becomes familiar, comfortable, even believable. But here's the deeper layer. The version you trust is often the version designed to be trusted. That doesn't mean people are dishonest. It means they are strategic. Not consciously most of the time, but through patterns they've learned over years. Patterns built from past experiences, from moments where being too much led to rejection, where being vulnerable led to pain, where being misunderstood had consequences. So they adjust. They present a version that feels safer. And if you're not paying attention, you accept that version as the whole truth. This is where misunderstanding begins because you're not seeing the person. You're seeing their adaptation. And adaptation is not identity. There's always a point where the gap appears between who someone is and who they've been showing you. Sometimes it shows up under pressure. Sometimes in conflict. Sometimes in the smallest, most unexpected moments. A joke that feels slightly defensive. A reaction that feels too sharp. A withdrawal that doesn't match the situation. And if you're paying attention, you notice it. But most people don't. They smooth it over. They tell themselves it's just a bad day. It's not a big deal. I'm probably overthinking. And sometimes that's true. But sometimes that moment is the first real glimpse of what was always there. The problem is not that people change. The problem is that we build certainty too early because the human mind craves clarity. It wants to label, to simplify, to feel like it understands. So it takes limited information and turns it into a complete story. This person is kind. This person is confident. This person is trustworthy. And once that story is formed, we protect it. Even when reality starts to contradict it, we ignore inconsistencies. We justify behavior. We explain away discomfort. Because changing our perception requires admitting we were wrong. And most people avoid that. But here's the shift that changes everything. Understanding people is not about judging faster. It's about observing longer. It's about noticing patterns, not moments. Because a single moment can be misleading, but patterns rarely lie. Anyone can be calm for a day. Anyone can be kind in the beginning. And anyone can say the right things when the situation is easy. But patterns reveal what's stable, what repeats, what shows up when there's nothing to gain. How do they react under pressure? How do they behave when things don't go their way? How do they treat people when there's no benefit involved? That's where the performance fades and something real begins to show. But here's what makes this even deeper. Most people are not aware of their own patterns. They don't wake up thinking this is the version I'm presenting. They believe they're being themselves because to them that version feels real. And in a way, it is just not complete. Because beneath that version, there are layers they haven't fully seen, reactions they don't question, emotions they don't understand, patterns they don't recognize. So when you try to understand someone, you're not just observing behavior. You're observing a system shaped by experiences, beliefs, fears, and habits that operate quietly in the background. And that's why people can seem inconsistent. Not because they are unpredictable, but because you're seeing different layers at different times. The calm version, the defensive version, the insecure version, the confident version. All of them are real, but none of them on their own are the full picture. And this is the illusion. The belief that what you see is the truth. It isn't. It never was. The moment you understand this, you stop being surprised by people. Not because you expect the worst, but because you stop expecting simplicity. You stop forming conclusions too early. You stop attaching to first impressions. You stop confusing surface behavior with deeper reality. And slowly you begin to see more. Not just what people say, not just what people do, but what repeats, what leaks through, what doesn't align. And instead of ignoring it, you pay attention. Because those moments are not random, they are signals. And once you stop believing what people show and start seeing what they repeat, something changes. You don't just understand people better. You become someone they can no longer confuse. And that is where real understanding begins. Chapter 2. The hidden forces behind every behavior. There's something most people never question. Not because it's complicated, but because it's invisible. Why do people act the way they do? At first glance, the answer seems simple. Because they choose to. Because they think a certain way. Because it makes sense to them. But if you watch closely, that explanation starts to fall apart. You've probably seen it before. Someone says they don't care, but their behavior says otherwise. Someone claims they're confident, but reacts defensively to the smallest comment. Someone insists they trust you, but keeps their distance. And if you take their words at face value, none of it makes sense. But behavior isn't driven by logic. It's driven by something deeper. There's always something underneath. A quiet force shaping what people say, how they react, and what they avoid. Most of the time, people aren't responding to what's happening right now. They're responding to something older, something familiar. You can see it in small moments. A simple disagreement turns into tension. A harmless comment feels like an attack. A delay in response creates anxiety. And from the outside it looks irrational. But from the inside it feels completely real. Because behavior isn't about the situation. It's about what the situation represents. And this is where everything starts to make sense. There are patterns behind almost every reaction. Not random, not accidental, but built over time. If you strip behavior down to its core, most of it comes from just a few hidden drives. The need to be accepted, the fear of being rejected, and the desire to feel in control. These forces don't announce themselves. People don't say, "I'm doing this because I'm afraid of being ignored." Instead, it shows up indirectly. Someone tries too hard to impress. Someone avoids difficult conversations. Someone gets defensive even when there's no real threat. And to them, it feels justified because they're not seeing the root. They're only feeling the effect. There's always a gap between what people do and why they do it. And most people never look past the surface, but once you start noticing it, you see it everywhere. That person who always needs attention, it's not confidence, it's fear of being overlooked. That person who shuts down in conflict, it's not calmness, it's avoidance. That person who always needs to be right, it's not strength, it's protection. Protection of identity, because when someone feels like their image is at risk, their behavior changes instantly, not consciously but automatically. This is why people can seem inconsistent, because different situations trigger different parts of them and each part is driven by something deeper. There's always that moment when someone reacts in a way that feels too strong for what just happened. That moment tells you everything because you're not seeing the situation anymore. You're seeing what it touched. An insecurity, a past experience, a fear they've been carrying longer than they realize. And this is where most people misunderstand others. They focus on the reaction instead of the trigger. They take things personally when it was never about them. They try to fix the surface without understanding what's underneath. But once you shift your perspective, something changes. Instead of asking why are they acting like this, you start asking what is this protecting? And that question opens everything. Because behavior is rarely random. It's usually protective. People protect their sense of worth, their sense of control, their sense of belonging. Even if it means acting in ways that don't make sense, even if it pushes others away. Even if it creates problems they don't want. Because to them, losing that internal stability feels worse than any external consequence. And that's why logic doesn't always work. You can explain things clearly. You can be reasonable. You can say all the right words. But if you're speaking to someone's logic, while their behavior is driven by emotion, you'll never fully reach them because emotion always comes first. Understanding this changes how you see everything. You stop expecting people to be consistent. You stop expecting them to be purely rational. You stop being surprised when behavior doesn't match words because now you're not looking at what they say. You're looking at what drives them. And once you see that, people become much easier to understand. Not because they change, but because you finally see what was always there. And that shift is where real insight begins. Chapter 3. Emotional triggers. The invisible switch that controls reactions. There's a moment you've probably experienced but didn't fully understand. Everything feels normal. The conversation is smooth. The energy is calm. And then something small happens. A sentence, a tone, a look. And suddenly everything changes. The other person reacts too fast, too strongly, too emotionally. And you're left thinking that didn't match the situation. But to them, it did. This is where most people get confused. They think reactions are based on what just happened. They're not. Reactions are based on what was triggered. There's always something underneath, an invisible switch. And when it gets activated, the response isn't about the present anymore. It's about something older. You can see it in subtle ways. Someone gets quiet after being interrupted. Someone becomes defensive over a small comment. Someone pulls away after feeling ignored. And on the surface, it looks disproportionate. But if you look deeper, it's not because the reaction is not to the moment. It's to what the moment represents. And this is what most people never realize. You are not reacting to what is happening. You're reacting to what it reminds you of. That's why the same situation can create completely different reactions in different people. One person laughs it off, another person shuts down, another person gets angry. Same moment, different trigger. And once you see this, human behavior starts to make sense. There are certain emotional triggers that show up again and again. The feeling of being disrespected, the fear of being ignored, the sense of losing control, the feeling of not being enough. These are not small things. They are deeply rooted, and when one of these gets activated, the reaction becomes automatic. Not chosen, not calculated, just immediate. That's why people often say things they don't mean or react in ways they later regret because in that moment they are not fully in control. The trigger is there's always a moment like this in every relationship. You say something simple but the response you get feels heavier than expected and you start thinking why did they react like that? But the better question is, what did that touch? Because every strong reaction points to something deeper, something unresolved, something sensitive, something that hasn't been fully understood, even by the person experiencing it. This is why trying to argue with someone in an emotional state rarely works because you're speaking to their logic while their reaction is coming from somewhere else. And logic cannot calm something that wasn't created by logic. This is also why people repeat the same reactions over and over again. Not because they want to, but because the trigger remains the same, unseen, unquestioned, unchanged. And until that changes, the pattern continues. This is where awareness becomes power. Because once you understand triggers, you stop taking reactions at face value. You stop seeing anger as just anger. You stop seeing silence as just silence. You stop seeing distance as just distance. You start seeing what's underneath. Protection, fear, insecurity. And suddenly things feel less personal. Not because they don't matter, but because you understand they were never fully about you. This changes how you respond. Instead of reacting immediately, you pause. Instead of escalating, you observe. Instead of taking it personally, you see the pattern. And that pause is where control returns. Not control over them, but control over yourself. And that's what most people miss. You don't need to control someone's reaction. You need to understand it, because once you understand what triggers people, you stop being surprised by them. You stop being pulled into emotional loops. You stop reacting automatically, and instead, you choose. You choose when to engage. You choose when to step back. You choose how much weight to give someone's reaction. And that's when something shifts. Because now you're no longer caught in the reaction. You're seeing it, and once you can see it, it loses its power over you. And that is where real control begins. Chapter 4. The patterns. People repeat without knowing. There's something strange about human behavior. People say they want change. They say they want better relationships, better outcomes, better decisions. And yet they keep choosing the same things, the same type of people, the same situations, the same reactions, even when it hurts them, even when they know better. And if you look at it from the outside, it doesn't make sense. Why would someone leave a bad situation only to walk into another one just like it? Why would someone recognize a mistake and still repeat it? It looks irrational, but it's not. It's patented. There's a quiet force behind this, one that most people don't notice. The human mind doesn't prioritize what is right. It prioritizes what is familiar. And familiarity feels safe, even when it isn't. That's why people often return to what they know instead of moving toward what's actually better for them, because what's better is uncertain and uncertainty feels like risk. But what's familiar, even if it's painful, feels predictable, and predictability feels like control. This is where patterns are formed. Not through logic but through repetition. Every experience leaves a trace. Every reaction reinforces something, and over time, those traces become automatic. You don't think about them anymore. You just follow them. There's always that moment when you notice it. Someone says, "I always end up in the same situation." And they don't understand why. But if you step back and look at the pattern, it's always been there. The same choices, the same responses, the same emotional reactions, just in different forms. Because patterns don't repeat exactly, they repeat in structure. The faces change, the environments change, the details change, but the dynamic stays the same. And that's why people feel stuck. Not because they lack options, but because they keep choosing within the same pattern. There's a deeper reason for this. Patterns are not random. They are built around emotional familiarity. What feels normal? What feels expected? What feels like this is just how things are? And most of the time that feeling comes from the past, from early experiences, from repeated situations, from environments that shaped how someone sees the world. If someone grew up feeling unheard, they may unconsciously gravitate towards situations where they feel the same way. Like if someone learned that attention must be earned, they may constantly seek approval. If someone experienced instability, they may either avoid closeness or cling to it too tightly. And none of this feels intentional because it isn't. It's automatic. That's why people can recognize a pattern and still not break it. Awareness alone is not enough because the pattern is not just mental. It's emotional. And emotion is stronger than logic. There's always that internal pull, a quiet voice that says, "This feels right," even when everything else says it isn't. And that's the trap. Because what feels right is often just what feels familiar. And familiarity is not always aligned with growth. This is why people repeat cycles. Not because they want to suffer, but because they're following something that feels known, something that doesn't require them to step into uncertainty. And breaking that pattern requires something most people avoid: discomfort. Because to choose differently, you have to act against what feels natural. You have to pause when your instinct tells you to react. You have to step back when your habit tells you to engage. You have to question what you've always assumed is normal. And that creates resistance because the mind doesn't like disruption. It prefers consistency. Even if that consistency keeps you stuck, this is where real change begins. Not when you understand the pattern, but when you interrupt it, even once. That moment matters more than people realize. Because patterns rely on repetition. And the moment you break the repetition, you weaken the pattern. But most people don't notice that moment. They move too fast. They react too quickly. They fall back into what feels natural. And the cycle continues. But if you slow down, if you pay attention, you'll start to see it. That brief pause before you respond. That moment where you could choose differently. That small window where awareness meets action. That's where everything changes. Because once you see the pattern and choose not to follow it, you step outside of it. And for the first time, you're not reacting from the past. You're responding in the present. This is also where understanding others becomes clearer. Because when you recognize your own patterns, you start to see them in others. You see how someone repeats the same reactions. How they fall into the same emotional loops. How they return to what feels familiar even when it costs them. And instead of judging it, you understand it. Because now you see the structure, you see the pattern behind the behavior. And that changes how you interpret everything. You stop asking why do they keep doing this? And you start asking what pattern are they following? And that question gives you clarity. Because once you see the pattern, you stop expecting a different outcome from the same behavior. You stop being surprised. You stop being pulled into the cycle. And most importantly, you stop repeating it yourself. Because the moment you understand patterns, you gain something most people don't have. Choice. Not the illusion of choice, but real choice. The ability to pause, to see, to decide. And that's rare because most people are not choosing, they're repeating. And once you truly understand that, you start seeing people differently, not as unpredictable, but as patterned, not as confusing, but as consistent in ways they don't even realize. And that shift is where deeper understanding begins. Chapter 5. What people show versus what they hide. There's something subtle that most people miss in everyday interactions. Not because it's hidden, but because it's quiet. People don't always lie with their words, but they rarely tell the full truth either. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but because what they show is carefully filtered. You've seen it before. Someone says, "I'm fine," and everything about them says otherwise. The pause is slightly longer. The tone is flatter. The energy feels different, and for a moment you notice it, but then you ignore it because the words are easier to accept than the feeling. This is where most people lose clarity. They trust what is said instead of what is shown. But words are only one layer and often not the most honest one. People learn early on how to say the right things, how to sound confident, how to appear calm, how to avoid conflict. And over time, language becomes a tool, a way to manage perception. Not always to deceive others, but to protect themselves. Because saying, "I'm not okay," requires vulnerability. And vulnerability feels risky. So instead, people soften the truth. They say less. They say something safer. They say something that won't create tension. And if you're only listening to words, you'll believe it. But if you're paying attention, you'll feel the difference. Because what people show is not just in what they say, it's in how they say it. The tone, the timing, the hesitation. Sometimes the silence says more than the sentence. There's always a gap between what people express and what they experience. And that gap is where truth lies. You can see it in small details. Someone agrees too quickly. Someone laughs at the wrong moment. Someone avoids eye contact when certain topics come up. These are not random. They are signals. Signals of something being held back. Not because people want to hide everything, but because they don't always feel safe revealing everything. And most of the time, they don't even realize they're doing it. Because this filtering becomes automatic. It becomes part of how they function. There's always a version of themselves they present to the world. The version that feels acceptable, the version that avoids rejection, the version that keeps things stable. And then there's everything underneath. Uncertainty, insecurity, doubt, emotion, things that don't always fit the image they want to maintain. So they manage it. They control what's visible. They adjust what they show. And over time, that gap becomes normal. This is why people can seem consistent on the surface, but feel different underneath. Because consistency is often maintained through control, not through authenticity. And this is where understanding deepens. Because once you stop focusing only on words, you start noticing patterns, not just in what people say, but in what they avoid, what topics make them shift, what questions they deflect, what moments create discomfort. These are not accidents. They point to something unspoken, something that hasn't been fully expressed. And once you start noticing this, conversations change. You stop reacting to the surface. You stop taking everything literally. You start reading the space between what is said and what is felt. And that space is where real understanding exists. But this is also where things become uncomfortable. Because seeing this clearly means you can no longer ignore it. You notice when someone isn't being honest, not necessarily lying, but holding something back, and you have a choice. You can ignore it and keep the interaction simple, or you can acknowledge it and step into something deeper. Most people choose the first because it's easier. It avoids tension. It keeps things predictable. But if you want to truly understand people, you have to be willing to see what's not obvious. To notice what others overlook. To stay present when something feels slightly off. Because those small moments are where truth leaks through. Not loudly, but subtly. A shift in tone. A pause before answering. A reaction that doesn't fully match the words. And if you learn to recognize these, you begin to see beyond the surface. You begin to understand not just what people say, but what they mean, not just what they show, but what they're trying to protect. And that changes everything. Because now you're no longer interacting with the version people present. You're understanding the person behind it. And once you reach that level, communication becomes different. You stop needing everything to be said directly. You start sensing what's there without it being explained. And that creates clarity. Not perfect clarity, but deeper awareness. And that awareness is what allows you to move through interactions without confusion, without overreacting, without misinterpreting signals. Because now you're not relying on words alone. You're seeing the full picture. And that is where real perception begins. Chapter 6. The Ego. Why people can't admit the truth. There's a moment you've probably witnessed before. Someone is clearly wrong. The evidence is there. The logic is clear. The situation is obvious. And yet they refuse to admit it. They defend their position. They justify their behavior. They shift the blame even when it would be easier to just say, "I was wrong." But they don't. And the question is why? It's not because they don't understand. Most of the time they do. It's because admitting the truth feels like losing something deeper than the argument. It feels like losing control, losing status, losing identity. And the human mind will do almost anything to avoid that feeling. This is the ego, not arrogance, not pride in the way people usually think of it. But a psychological structure that protects how someone sees themselves. And once you understand this, a lot of behavior starts to make sense because people are not just defending an idea. They are defending themselves. There's always something at stake. If someone believes they are intelligent, being wrong threatens that identity. If someone sees themselves as a good person, being called out feels like an attack. If someone values control, uncertainty feels unbearable. So instead of accepting the truth, they reshape it. They explain it differently. They reinterpret what happened. They focus on details that support their version. Not because they want to deceive others, but because they need to protect how they see themselves. And most of this happens automatically. They don't sit there thinking, "I'm going to protect my ego." It just feels like they are right. That's what makes it so convincing. There's always a moment like this in conversation. You say something reasonable, something calm, something clear, and instead of considering it, the other person reacts. They interrupt, they dismiss. They become defensive. And it feels frustrating because you're trying to communicate, but they're not listening. But here's what's actually happening. They are listening just not to understand. They are listening to respond. Listening to protect. Listening to defend. Because the moment they feel challenged, the ego steps in. And once that happens, the goal is no longer truth. The goal is stability. To maintain the image, to maintain control, to maintain consistency with how they see themselves. And this is why arguments often go nowhere, because both sides are trying to be right instead of trying to understand. And when ego is involved, being right feels more important than being accurate. There's another layer to this. Ego doesn't just protect against others. It protects against internal discomfort. Because admitting the truth often requires facing something uncomfortable, a mistake, a weakness, a blind spot, and that creates tension. So instead of sitting with that feeling, the mind avoids it. It shifts attention. It rationalizes. It minimizes anything to reduce the discomfort. That's why people can hold on to beliefs even when evidence contradicts them. Because letting go of the belief means letting go of certainty, and certainty feels safe even if it's wrong. This is also why people repeat the same mistakes. Not because they don't see them, but because seeing them clearly would require changing how they see themselves. And that's not easy. There's always resistance. Subtle but powerful. You can notice it in yourself. That moment when someone points something out and your first reaction is to defend before you even fully process what they said. That's the ego. Not something separate from you, but a part of you trying to keep your identity intact. And once you recognize it, you start to see it everywhere, in conversations, in decisions, in reactions. People holding on to positions long after they stop making sense. People avoiding accountability even when it would help them grow. People rejecting feedback because it feels uncomfortable. And instead of seeing it as irrational, you begin to understand it because now you see what's underneath. Protection not of truth but of identity. And that changes how you respond. Instead of trying to force someone to see your point, you recognize the resistance. You see where they feel threatened and you adjust, not to manipulate, but to reduce friction. Because the more someone feels attacked, the stronger their ego becomes and the less likely they are to listen. This is why calm people are harder to argue with. Not because they always have better arguments, but because they are less driven by ego. They don't need to prove themselves. They don't need to win every point. And that gives them something powerful. Flexibility, the ability to consider new perspectives, the ability to admit when they're wrong, the ability to change. And that's rare because most people are not trying to grow in the moment. They're trying to protect themselves. And once you understand this, you stop expecting people to behave purely logically. You stop being surprised when they defend the indefensible. You stop taking resistance personally because now you see the mechanism behind it. And more importantly, you start to notice it in yourself. That moment of defensiveness, that instinct to justify, that urge to protect your position, and instead of following it automatically, you pause. You question it. You ask, am I protecting the truth or protecting myself? And that question changes everything. Because the moment you step outside your ego, you gain clarity. Real clarity, not the kind that comes from being right, but the kind that comes from seeing clearly. And once you develop that, you interact differently. You argue less. You observe more. You listen differently, not just to what is said, but to what is being defended. And that allows you to understand people on a deeper level. Because now you're not just hearing their words, you're seeing what they're protecting. And that is where real insight begins. Chapter 7. The Mirror. Why understanding yourself changes everything. There's something most people overlook when they try to understand others. They focus outward. They observe behavior. They analyze reactions. They try to read patterns, and that's important, but it's incomplete because there's a limit to how deeply you can understand someone else if you don't understand yourself. You can recognize behavior, but you won't fully understand it. You can see reactions, but you won't always interpret them clearly because everything you see is filtered through you. Your experiences, your assumptions, your patterns, and those filters shape what you notice and what you miss. There's always a moment when this becomes clear. You react to something, not because of what happened, but because of what it meant to you. A comment feels disrespectful. A delay feels like rejection. A silence feels uncomfortable, and in that moment, your reaction feels justified, completely real. But if you step back, you might realize something. Someone else in the exact same situation would not react the same way because they don't carry the same internal patterns. And that's the key. Understanding others requires understanding your own reactions first. Because the things that trigger you are the same things that can distort your perception. If you feel easily disrespected, you'll see disrespect even where it doesn't exist. If you fear being ignored, you'll interpret distance as rejection. If you need control, uncertainty will feel like a threat. And without awareness, you won't question it. You'll assume it's real, or this is where misunderstanding begins. Not in what others do, but in how you interpret it. Because interpretation is not neutral. It's shaped by your past, by your experiences, by the patterns you've developed over time. That's why two people can see the same situation and walk away with completely different conclusions. One feels hurt, the other feels nothing. Same moment, different lens. And most people never question their lens. They trust it. They assume their interpretation is the truth. But it isn't. It's just one version of it. And until you recognize that, your ability to understand others will always be limited. There's always that moment when someone says something and you react instantly before thinking, before analyzing, just reacting. That reaction tells you something. Not about them, but about you. It shows you where your sensitivities are, where your patterns exist, where your perception might be distorted. And most people ignore that. They focus outward. They blame. They judge. They assume. Instead of asking, why did that affect me this way? That question changes everything because it turns your attention inward. And once you start doing that, you begin to see your own patterns the same way you see them in others. You notice how you react under pressure, how you respond to criticism, how you interpret silence, and suddenly you realize something important. You are not as neutral as you thought. You are patterned too. You have triggers, you have biases, you have automatic reactions. And once you see that, your understanding deepens because now you're not just observing behavior. You're comparing it. You're recognizing structure. You're seeing how similar mechanisms play out in different people. And that creates clarity, not just about others, but about human behavior in general. This is where your perspective shifts. You stop assuming. You stop reacting immediately. You start questioning your first impression. You give yourself space to see more. And that space is where understanding grows. Because when you're not controlled by your own reactions, you can observe more accurately. You can notice details you would have missed before. You can interpret behavior with less bias, and that makes a difference. Because most people are not seeing clearly, they are reacting to their own filters and projecting them onto others. That's why misunderstandings happen. Not because people are complex, but because perception is distorted. And once you clean that distortion, everything becomes clearer. You start seeing behavior for what it is, not what it feels like. And that distinction matters because feelings can mislead but patterns don't. This is also where control begins. Not control over others but control over yourself. The ability to pause, to notice your reaction without immediately acting on it, to question your interpretation before accepting it as truth. And that gives you something rare. Objectivity. The ability to see a situation without being fully consumed by it. And once you have that, your interactions change. You become less reactive, less defensive, less influenced by emotional noise, and more aware, more observant, more precise in how you understand people. Because now you're not just seeing them, you're seeing yourself, too. And that creates balance. You're not projecting, you're observing. And that makes your understanding more accurate, more grounded, more real. This is why self-awareness is not separate from understanding others. It is the foundation of it. Because the clearer you see yourself, the clearer you see everything else. And without that clarity, everything gets filtered, distorted, misinterpreted. But with it, you start to see patterns as they are, not as you feel them. And that changes everything. Because now you're not just reacting to people, you're understanding them. And that shift is where true awareness begins. Chapter 8. The Shift. Becoming someone who sees through people. There's a point where everything you've been noticing starts to come together. Not all at once, but gradually. You begin to see patterns faster. You notice reactions more clearly. You understand behavior without needing it explained. And something changes. You stop feeling confused by people. Not because people become simpler, but because you start seeing them differently. There's a subtle shift that happens. Before you reacted, now you observe. Before you took things personally, now you pause. Before you tried to figure people out in the moment, now you watch the pattern. And that changes everything. Because once you stop reacting immediately, you create space. Space to think, space to see, space to understand. And most people don't have that space. They move too quickly. They react to tone. They react to words. They react to emotion. And in doing so, they get pulled into situations without fully understanding them. But when you slow down, you start to notice something. Most interactions are predictable, not in detail, but in structure. People repeat the same emotional patterns, the same defensive behaviors, the same ways of responding to pressure. And once you recognize those patterns, you stop being surprised. You start anticipating not what someone will say, but how they will react. And that gives you an advantage. Not to control them, but to stay grounded. There's always that moment in conversation when someone shifts. Their tone changes. Their energy tightens. Their words become sharper. Before you would have reacted, now you notice it. And instead of matching their reaction, you stay steady. And that stability changes the dynamic. Because most people expect reaction. They expect emotion. They expect engagement at the same level. But when it doesn't come, they lose rhythm. And that reveals something. Their behavior wasn't just expression. It was also expectation. And when that expectation is not met, they adjust. This is where your awareness becomes visible. Not through what you say, but through what you don't do. You don't escalate. You don't chase. You don't react impulsively. And that creates a different kind of presence, a quiet one, but a strong one. Because now you are not easily influenced. And people feel that even if they can't explain it. There's something about someone who doesn't react the way others expect. It creates a pause, a shift in energy. Because most interactions are built on patterns, predictable exchanges, action and reaction. But when you step outside that pattern, the dynamic changes. You're no longer part of the loop. You're observing it, and that gives you clarity. You start to see who seeks control, who seeks approval, who avoids discomfort. Not by what they say, but by how they behave. When the situation becomes uncertain, and uncertainty is where truth appears, because that's when people lose their usual control. That's when patterns show up more clearly. And when you're not reacting, you can see it. There's also something else that changes. You stop needing to prove anything. You don't need to correct every misunderstanding. You don't need to win every argument. You don't need to explain yourself to everyone, because you understand something most people don't. Not everyone is ready to see clearly. Not everyone wants to understand. And trying to force that only creates friction. So instead you become selective. Selective with your energy. Selective with your attention. Selective with your responses. And that's where real control begins. Not in controlling others, but in choosing how you engage. There's a difference between reacting and responding. Reaction is automatic, immediate, emotional, unfiltered. Response is intentional, measured, aware, controlled. And once you make that shift, you start living differently. You don't get pulled into every situation. You don't absorb every emotion. You don't feel the need to match every intensity because you understand that not everything requires a response, and that changes how people interact with you. Some will feel it immediately. They'll notice that you're harder to provoke, harder to read, harder to influence. Others may not understand it, but they'll still feel the difference because your presence becomes steady. And stability is rare, especially in environments where people react constantly. This is also where detachment begins. Not coldness, not distance, but clarity. The ability to see without being consumed, to understand without being affected, to engage without losing control. And that's powerful because most people are controlled by what they feel in the moment. But when you create that separation, you gain freedom. Freedom from overreacting. Freedom from overthinking. Freedom from unnecessary emotional weight. And that allows you to move differently, more precisely, more intentionally, more effectively. You start to notice which situations matter, which ones don't, which people are consistent, which ones are driven by patterns they haven't seen. And instead of trying to change them, you adjust your expectations. You stop expecting consistency from someone who has none. You stop expecting clarity from someone who is confused. You stop expecting stability from someone who is reactive. And that reduces frustration, because frustration often comes from expecting people to be different than they are. But once you see clearly, you stop expecting. You start understanding. And understanding creates calm. Not because everything is perfect, but because everything makes sense. Even when it's messy, even when it's unpredictable, even when it doesn't go your way, you understand the structure behind it. And that changes how you experience it. You become less reactive, less emotionally pulled, less affected by other people's instability, and more grounded. More aware, more in control of yourself. And that's the real shift. Not becoming someone who controls others, but becoming someone who cannot be easily controlled. Because once you understand how people think, how they react, how they repeat patterns, you stop being influenced by surface behavior. You see what's underneath, and that makes you harder to manipulate, harder to confuse, harder to pull into unnecessary conflict. And at the same time, you become easier to understand because you're not hiding behind reactions. You're acting with awareness, and that creates a different kind of presence, one that doesn't demand attention, but naturally holds it. Because clarity is rare, and people feel it when they encounter it. This is where everything comes together. You understand behavior. You recognize patterns. You see triggers. You notice ego. You observe yourself. And all of it leads to one thing: perspective. The ability to step back and see clearly without distortion, without immediate reaction, without being pulled into every emotional current. And from that place you make better decisions. You respond with intention. You move with awareness, and you interact with people on a completely different level. Not based on assumptions, but based on understanding. And once you reach that point, something becomes clear. The real advantage was never control. It was clarity. Because once you see clearly, you no longer need to force anything. You understand what's happening, and that understanding guides everything you do. And that is where true power exists. Here's the thing most people don't realize. Understanding people isn't something you learn once. It's something you start seeing everywhere. After everything you've just heard, something shifts. Not dramatically, not instantly, but quietly. You begin to notice more the pauses in conversation, the reactions that don't match the moment, the patterns that repeat in different forms. And slowly you start seeing people more clearly. Not just what they say, not just what they show, but what's underneath. And once that awareness begins, it doesn't turn off. You start recognizing behaviors you used to overlook. You start understanding reactions that once confused you. You start seeing the difference between what people express and what they actually feel. And that changes how you move through the world, because now you're no longer reacting blindly. You're observing, you're choosing, you're understanding, and that creates something rare. Calm. Not the kind of calm that comes from everything being easy, but the kind that comes from seeing things clearly. Because when you understand people, you stop expecting them to be perfect. You stop expecting consistency from those who are still figuring themselves out. You stop taking every reaction personally. And most importantly, you stop trying to control what you were never meant to control, other people. Instead, you shift your focus to the only thing you truly have influence over, your awareness, your reactions, your perspective. And that's where real change happens. Because the moment you stop trying to control others, you start gaining control over yourself. And that changes everything. You respond differently. You don't get pulled into every argument. You don't feel the need to prove yourself. You don't chase validation from people who don't understand you. Because you see what's driving them. And once you see that, you stop being affected in the same way. Not because you don't care, but because you understand. And understanding creates distance. Not emotional distance, but mental clarity. The ability to see something without being consumed by it. And that is powerful, because most people are constantly reacting to opinions, to tone, to behavior without ever stopping to ask what's actually happening here. But now you do. And that question alone changes how you experience everything. You become less reactive, more intentional, more aware of what truly matters. And over time, that awareness compounds. It shows up in your conversations, in your decisions, in the way you handle difficult situations. You start choosing when to engage and when to step back. You start recognizing patterns earlier. You start avoiding unnecessary conflict. And you begin to move through life with more clarity and less confusion. And here's what's interesting. As you change, people notice. Not always consciously, but they feel it. They feel that you're harder to influence, harder to provoke, harder to pull into emotional reactions. And that shifts how they interact with you. Because when you're not reacting, you're not playing the same game. And when you're not playing the same game, you're no longer controlled by it. That's the real shift. Not becoming someone who controls others, but becoming someone who is no longer easily controlled. And that's where freedom begins. Freedom from unnecessary stress. Freedom from emotional confusion. Freedom from constantly trying to figure people out, because now you understand them. Not perfectly, but deeply enough to see what matters and what doesn't. And once you reach that point, life feels different, simpler. Not because everything is easy, but because everything makes more sense. And when things make sense, you stop fighting them. You start working with them. You start navigating instead of reacting. And that's a completely different way to live. So as you move forward from here, don't try to apply everything at once. Just start noticing. Notice patterns. Notice reactions. Notice what's said and what's not. And most importantly, notice yourself. Because the more aware you become, the clearer everything else will be. And over time, that clarity becomes natural. It becomes how you see the world. And once that happens, you won't just understand people better, you will understand yourself better, too. And that is where everything truly begins. If this shifted the way you see things, stay with it, because the more you observe, the more you'll understand. And the more you understand, the less you'll be controlled by what you don't see. And that is the quiet power of awareness.